In the late 90s, SCE Cambridge studio, formerly Millennium Interactive, released MediEvil. It was a technical showcase for the PlayStation's 3D capabilities, but it was also a victim of the era's hardware limitations. Running here at a 9x internal resolution upscale to 4K, the art direction of Jason Wilson and Chris Sorrell finally has room to breathe. But the real star isn't the pixel count, it's the PGXP correction. On original hardware, the PS1 lacked a floating point unit, leading to integer rounding errors that caused the infamous texture warping and a vertex snapping you see on Dan's armor and the surrounding gravestones. By using PGXP to intercept those vertex coordinates and process them with high-precision floating point math, we've effectively removed the jitter that defined the 32-bit era. This is Galloway as it was intended to look in the concept art, stabilized and razor-sharp. Technically, MediEvil sits in an interesting spot between the era's rigid tank controls and the true 360-degree movement that would soon become the industry standard. The engine utilizes a spline-based camera system. Rather than a fully dynamic camera that follows Dan, the developers programmed specific paths for the lens to move along, ensuring the player always had the best view of the pre-rendered style geometry without the overhead of a fully free-roaming camera. The combat system highlights the PS1's handling of clipping and collision boxes. When Dan performs his 360-degree spin attack, the engine is calculating a simple radius check against the enemy's bounding box. You'll notice how Dan's arm, functioning as a boomerang-style projectile, doesn't actually have a physics-based arc. It's a scripted pathing logic that was far less demanding on the CPU than real-time physics, allowing the developers to keep more polygons on the screen for the environment. This level also introduces the life bottles and the soul mechanic. From a data management perspective, the game is constantly tracking the jawless percentage in the background. This was a clever way to encourage full-level exploration without needing complex quest logs. It's a simple kill counter tied to a specific world state trigger that unlocks the Hall of Heroes portal upon level completion. Before we leave the cemetery, it's worth noting that MediEvil almost didn't look like this. Early in development, the project was intended for multiple platforms, including the Sega Saturn. However, once Sony acquired Cambridge Studio, the engine was heavily optimized specifically for the PlayStation's GTE, the Geometric Transformation Engine. This hardware-specific focus is why the game features such high poly-count character models for 1998, with Sir Dan himself composed of roughly 300 polygons. Another interesting piece of history is the voice of Dan. The muffled, jawless grunts were provided by Jason Wilson, the game's lead designer. It wasn't just a creative choice, it was a practical one that saved on the lip-syncing animations that would have taxed the animation budget and the console's limited VRAM. As we step into the green portal, the game triggers a complete flush of the level data to make room for the Hall of Heroes. This isn't just a visual transition, it's a separate executable state. The hall functions as a trophy room and a progression gate, where the game checks that the Chalice's flag we triggered in the cemetery. Technically, this area is far less demanding on the hardware, allowing the engine to push higher resolution textures on the statues of the heroes than what we see in the standard gameplay levels. It's a clever use of the PS1's limited 1 MB of VRAM, allocating resources where the player has the time to actually stop and look.
Not that there's anything clever.
Tapping out of the Hall of Heroes, we hit Cemetery Hill. This level is a distinct shift in geometry design compared to the first stage. While the cemetery was mostly flat, this is a vertical climb that forces the engine to calculate a much larger draw distance. The boulders rolling down the hill are a classic example of cheap but effective 32-bit hazards. These aren't physics-based objects in the modern sense, they are unscripted paths with simple spherical collision boxes. On the original hardware, having too many of these boulders active at once would cause significant frame jitter, so the developers utilized a spawner system that only activates the objects when Dan enters a specific trigger zone. You'll also notice the lava-filled chasms. Technically, this isn't dynamic lighting or fluid simulation. It's a scrolling texture with an emissive property applied to the polygons. It's a trick used across the PS1 library to simulate glowing heat without actually taxing the console's limited lighting engine, which was already working hard to process the Gouraud shading on Dan's model. Behind the jittering vertices of Gallifrey was a studio in transition. SCE Cambridge, formerly Millennium Interactive, was a team learning 3D development on the fly. Led by Chris Sorrell and artist Jason Wilson, the studio had to pivot mid-development from a Sega Saturn project to a flagship Sony exclusive. This transition is technically visible in the game's DNA. While the character models were high poly for the time, the team had to lean on creative solutions to hide their lack of experience with 3D hardware. For example, Sir Dan's lack of a jaw wasn't just a design choice, it was a technical bypass, removing the need for complex lip-syncing that the engine's animation budget couldn't yet handle. It's a reminder that some of gaming's most iconic character traits were born directly from the limitations of the silicon they were built on. Beyond the early levels, the Cambridge engine utilized a primitive but effective version of Dynamic LOD. To maintain a consistent 30 frames per second target, the engine swapped high-poly character models for lower-resolution proxies based on their distance from the camera's focal point. This was a necessity for the PlayStation's GTE, which could only process a limited number of transformed polygons per second before the framerate would tank. Another significant hurdle was the console's 512 kilobytes of video RAM. To create the game's vibrant, Burton-esque color palette, the developers relied heavily on palletized textures. By restricting individual assets to specific color lookup tables, they were able to pack significantly more visual variety into the memory than the hardware should have allowed. It's a classic example of 32-bit development, using software-side creativity to bypass the rigid limitations of the silicon. Looking back, MediEvil represents a pivotal moment for the UK development scene. It was the result of Millennium Interactive, a studio rooted in the 16-bit era, evolving into SCE Cambridge and learning the complexities of 3D math on the fly. While it may lack the technical surgical precision of its Japanese contemporaries, it succeeded by leaning into a stylized art direction that turned hardware flaws into aesthetic choices. The wobbles of the textures and the integer-based rounding errors of the PS1 hardware didn't break the experience, they actually enhanced the jagged, Gothic atmosphere the team was aiming for. Sir Dan Vertex wasn't just a mascot, he was a character whose very design was dictated by the era's budget and technical constraints. This retrospective serves as a reminder that the most memorable titles of the 90s weren't always the most technically perfect, but rather the ones that knew exactly how to hide their seams.